Gary Ackerman and of the Ackerman Group. We are here to give our another one of our Tuesday evening webinars on, this is our 6-part series on selling my veterinary hospital. And this is the one on the sale process, what you need to know. We're on part 5 of these right now. And these have been relatively well received. We've had a number of experts on a regular basis on these calls, and we're just happy to provide good information to the people that are interested in this market and bring on experts that have the good information to tell everybody who has an interest in updating themselves and what's going on in the market. And so these are the ones that we've been doing so far. They're all on the ones that we've done previous to this are all on our website under the knowledge base if you'd like to look at any of them previously. And 2 weeks from now, we're going to have kind of our market update and our wrap up on it. We're going to have a couple people from some of the companies that are buying practices on to talk a little bit about what they're seeing in the market today. We're going to give you some advice as far as and some thoughts on what we're seeing in the market today. But the bottom line is this has been a really good series all along, been well received, and we're just happy to get the information out and have things here that you can piecemeal on all the different sections of it. The piece today is kind of a high level discussion about what goes on in the process of selling your veterinary practice. So we're going to kind of have the before, the during, and the after different speakers on here that are going to go over these different pieces of it. And we're looking forward to helping you get a little bit more education and just ask some questions of people that are involved in these literally, day to day. This is what we do every day. Couple of quick things on it. There's a button on the bottom here on your Zoom that you can ask a question. You can also raise your hand. There's a chat button. All of these are ways that you can ask questions, and we really encourage everybody to ask questions. We've got people here that are it's an educational call. We're gonna stay on script, but we're happy to kind of delve off script a little bit if we need to answer the questions, because these are things that everybody has just lots of questions about the different sections of it. And we're going to go over a lot of different sections, and we've got 3 people on today that work in these areas literally every day. So it's going to be very, very good, I think, as far as what what kind of information you're getting. A little background, I'm Dr. Gary Ackerman. I'm the founder of Ackerman Group, and we've been involved in working with practice transitions since 2001. It's when I sold my practices. We've done all kinds of different things related to veterinary practice transitions. We've brokered the practices, we've advised on the transactions. I did 1031 exchanges on veterinary practice real estate for at least 10 years. I did financial planning and investments for veterinarians for at least another 7 or 8 years. I quit counting how many transactions we've been involved with. It says here 100 corporate practice sales, but that's probably old. We've been involved with many more than that. We've also done at least 70 of the joint venture and private equity roll-ups and sales, and this is a lot of what you're seeing on the market today. And so we are going to talk a little bit about that today, but I in almost all of the situations we're seeing different types of things coming down the pike now than you might have seen 3, 5, 7 years ago. These are, in our minds, they're more complicated transactions. They're more complex, but in a good way. They allow you to stay involved in your practice or involved in the company, and it's financially beneficial in a time that you're probably going to have to be working in your practice for a period of times after the transaction anyway. The bottom line is we've got a very holistic approach to doing these transactions with people. We really want to integrate with you and all of your other advisors. This is probably the most material financial transaction you're going to go through in your lifetime potentially. And we think that this is something that you need to have good planning. You need good legal advisors, you need good CPA work on it, financial planning, estate planning. All of these are things that we tell people that you may need. They may all be ongoing at the same time that you're doing your practice transaction. So we encourage everybody to get educated advice, in particular the advice that is educated about exactly what you're doing in a veterinary transaction. This is not a process anymore to go down this path by yourself. So in that vein, what we really want to do is we want to talk to you a little bit about what we do in our model for success. We really have kind of 3 legs to the stool, and we're looking to find you basically the best fit, the company that is really going to fit with your practice personality the best? Is it going to fit in your culture, with your clients, with your staff, with your associate doctors? All of these things that really matter in picking a partner, because you're going to probably be working there for several years, and this company is going to be involved in your practice for many years to come. We're also looking for potentially the best price. This is something, it is a financial transaction for you, and so what we are looking to do is make sure that you get the best price, but concurrent with that, we're also looking for the best terms. Terms are very material in these transactions, and I'm sure Trey, our attorney, will get into some of these. This is everything from your employment agreement to what you're investing in, if you've got a joint venture or a private equity, to the different pieces of the transaction. Is there any holdbacks, or is there any earnouts? What are all of these things look like? What does your lease look like? These are all pieces of things that are material in putting these transactions together. And so what we like to say is that you're looking for all of these. You're trying to find where all of these merge together, because we tell everybody it's not just about price. And where we're seeing today is that the market is pricing is quite attractive, but all of these other things have to come together in order to make a really successful transaction for you. So we're all about helping to educate you to understand all of the three legs of the stool, because to really get it right and not fall off the stool, it's really helpful to get all three of these. So in that vein, what we're going to do today is educate you a little bit about what the process is like, from a high level, and going through and doing a practice sale transaction. It's pretty simple. We're not going to get into the weeds on some of the different areas of it. We do that on some of the other calls. This is really what's the process look like. And so in that vein, I'm going to turn the program over to my COO, Jeff Hooper, let him talk a little bit about where things are when we start these transactions, and then we're going to hand off to a couple of other people that talk about how to actually get the transaction done, and then what happens at the practice level operationally when these transactions are occurring. So with that, Jeff.
Thank you, Gary. It's a great introduction there. Before I dive in, I just want to give you a little bit of background on me. I haven't been the main speaker here. You've heard Gary quite a bit on these webinars, but I've been with the company a couple of years now. I'm kind of a financial guy, about 30 years in financial services. Was a financial planner actually for a long time, about 16 years as a financial planner. Sold my practice quite a while ago, kind of near the peak of the dot-com bubble, if any of you remember that. It wasn't right at the top, but it was close. And really spent the rest of my career shortly after that in consulting. Did a lot of technology and consulting work in financial services, worked on some web platforms. Back then, this is early 2000s, internet's kind of new, and everyone's trying to find ways to utilize the internet and web platforms. Did a lot of consulting in financial services area there. Kind of branched off into real estate, did a lot of financial consulting on the real estate side, funding either debt or private equity for real estate developments. Did a little bit of developing myself, even got into historic and low income tax credit consulting. So not much to do with the veterinary industry. I've known Gary for about as long, about 30 years. He and I met a long time ago. But he and I joined up forces in January of 2019. And timing was probably pretty good, with the demand that's in the marketplace, where Ackerman Group is growing, had double-digit growth, not just in terms of practice sales, but in terms of dollar volume as well. So good place to be. Love the vet industry. Haven't spent a lot of time here, although my wife is a 15-year veteran with Royal Canin. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that name. She has worked on the nutrition side for a long time, so very familiar with the vet industry. But tonight's topic really is just to talk at kind of a high level. As Gary mentioned, we're not going to get down in the weeds too much, but we want to talk a little bit about just the sale process, so that you do understand, if you are thinking about selling your practice, kind of what's involved. It's a lot. I'll start there. But really, I'm sure as Gary and I talk all the time, we rarely talk to veterinarians that have not had some kind of a conversation, typically with a buyer, whether it's their associate or a corporate buyer in the marketplace. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out where to start. If you're starting because someone offered you, some money for your practice, I guess that's one place to start, but you certainly should dig a little deeper to see if the price that was offered is something that is, market price or would be valuable for you. So really, we really recommend everyone do some pre-sale planning. It's important for you to think about, you've spent years building this practice and it's your largest financial asset. If you sold it, what does that mean? Can you replace your income? Can you sell it for enough capital that you could, after taxes, be able to replace the income that you're generating as a working veterinarian? So financial planning is extremely important. If you don't have a financial planner, you should probably find one. They can do a cash flow analysis, kind of give you an idea of what it might take for you to, what you might need to net from the sale of your practice to even think about selling your practice. As Trey's going to talk a little bit in a minute about some of the legal aspects, there's a lot of planning that needs to get done there on the legal side in terms of the way your corporation is structured. A lot of that has to do with some of the tax implications of legal structure. And then really some tax and estate planning. With some of the multiples we're seeing today, there is some just amazing value that's built into some of your practices and can create some significant tax issues, which is not a bad issue to have, but also can create some estate planning issues. So it's important to be thinking about all of these things as you begin to sort of go down this road of thinking about selling your practice. Secondly is what should I do it myself? I've just got this great offer from a buyer that I know about, and this is more than I ever thought my practice is worth. I think I'll just sell it to them myself. Why should I pay an advisor, right? And I would caution you to say that there's probably costs associated with both. Obviously, an advisor like Ackerman Group or others would charge you a commission or a fee for our services. We feel like we earn it. We earn our fee. But there's a cost associated with that. But there's also a cost associated with probably doing it yourself. There's a lot of things that you may leave on the table if you're not getting some good advice. And that could be very costly. It could cost you significantly more than you might pay a broker or a financial advisor or a qualified attorney to help get this done. So I would just really advise everybody to, think long and hard about how you might want to go through this process. Because if you think that just signing on the bottom line for a letter of intent because someone has offered it to you, that's kind of just the beginning. And I think that's what we're going to get to in a minute. Is that that's not the hard part. The hard part is after you sign that letter of intent. That's when the real hard negotiations begin. And again, if you're selling to a corporate entity, you are working, not necessarily against, but the folks on the other side of the table are very sophisticated financial advisors, private equity folks, business development people, most of them with MBAs. They know the business. So if you don't have somebody sitting on your side of the table, or you're not maybe as well schooled in some of those areas, it's a good possibility that it could be costly for you. And then I guess, who do you sell to? I mean, all of you, I'm sure, have had some conversations or at least a desire to sell to one of your associates. And I'm sure you've been approached by some of your associates on buying your practice. If you look at kind of where the value for practices today from the corporations, there's really, as much as you might like to sell to an associate from a financial perspective, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, but it's probably, the value is probably half selling to an associate, because unless the associate has the cash to pay you for your practice, they have to go to a bank and borrow it. And banks are only going to borrow or loan money at about a 5 or 6 times earnings number, which is less than half of what you could sell your practice for today in the corporate market. So I'm sure that those of you that know us probably have already figured out that's really all we do, is we sell veterinary practices to the corporate market. So that's kind of the balance of this conversation. Be happy to chat with anybody that is thinking about selling to an associate. We can get you involved with some lenders or some other folks that might be able to help at least, explore that path. Because it is obviously, if you've got someone that's worked for you for a long time, it's something that you would at least want to explore. But I think you're probably going to find out that it's a little bit too costly to go that route. So the rest of our discussion here tonight is going to be around the corporate buying process. And again, if you assume that if you're going to go that way, how do you find the right buyer? Is it the buyer that has already made you an offer or has already sent you a letter of intent? Is that the one that you go with? Possibly. It's possible that that's the right one. But I would really recommend, and we recommend highly that to find the right buyer, we kind of equate it to dating, right? You need to go on a lot of dates. And that's what we do for our clients. We put you in front, we set you up with a lot of blind dates. You sort of go out with them and come back to us or decide whether you'd like to go on a second date to get to know the company, get to know the culture, get to know the people you'll be working with. As Gary mentioned earlier on the fit portion of our model is probably the most important. I don't think there's probably enough money that would make up for 6 or 8 years or less of misery post-sale if you don't really have a good relationship with the folks that buy you. And I'm sure all of you have heard some horror stories, and maybe some of your colleagues that this has happened to. So go on a lot of dates, and then eventually you're going to get engaged. We call that being engaged to get married. It's signing that letter of intent. And even that's not final. You're just you're sort of agreeing to get married or agreeing to do business together. But that's really the first big step that you would take after exploring the market quite a bit. Again, if you're going down this path, you've got to be extremely confident on your financial picture. One thing you don't want to have happen in this situation is for your potential buyer, if you're talking to one, you don't want them to be telling you what your financial picture looks like. You need to know before you begin those discussions. In Ackerman Group, we put together what we would call a bulletproof EBITDA. The EBITDA, if you aren't familiar with that term, we got a couple of really good webinars on EBITDA. It's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Right? It's your bottom line. It's your profit, and that's what corporations are paying for. But if they're the ones telling you what your EBITDA is, I would be a little suspect of that. You really need an advisor, or at least somebody to be very, very confident that what you're taking to market is something that a buyer can rely on, because they're really going to purchase your first year's earnings number post sale. That's what they're paying for, and they're going to make sure that everything that you tell them is actually in your financial projections. So those are two really important things as you start looking for a buyer. Obviously, when you find that buyer that you're really comfortable with, they've made you an offer based on your bulletproof EBITDA, and you've signed that letter of intent. Okay. Again, that seems like anybody can do that, right? That's really when the fun begins. So after you sign that letter of intent, you're in for at least 60 to 90 days of due diligence. And that letter of intent, even though it's non-binding, is really where we really try to get as much as we can into that letter of intent. So obviously we want to get your earnings number in there. That's not going to change, because there will be some more analysis that happens after you sign the letter of intent. Obviously, the pricing is based on that earnings number. It's usually a multiple of earnings. It's either 10 times earnings, 12 times earnings. We're seeing, in today's market, pricing jumping up in the 12s and 13s, even higher for some of the bigger practices. So truly a seller's market, which is the best news. In that letter of intent, we're going to see kind of the structure of your transaction. Is it an all cash? Gary mentioned the joint ventures and the private equity transactions and structures that we've done. We kind of pride ourselves on doing customized transactions that may involve associates, various structures or percentages venture versus complicated. Can get whether you want cash now or want to participate in some growth going forward. Your employment and non-compete agreements are going to be a big part of that letter of intent. We want most of the details in there. What is going to happen if your associates don't sign a 1-year agreement or a 2-year agreement post-sale? What are the contingencies around that? And then your real estate, you know, these folks are going to be leasing your building if you are an owner of the building. Setting those terms is extremely important because that's going to increase the value of your real estate. So again, the letter of intent is extremely important, but it's just the beginning of the process. I'll pause for just a second. Just a reminder to answer, pop any questions you have into the chat function or into the Q&A, or raise your hand. Be happy to answer any questions you might have. So the first phase after you've signed your letter of intent is what we call financial due diligence. Now we have presented, and you have presented your buyer with an EBITDA number that came from your profit and loss statement minus anything that is not going to transfer with your business. Right. So in the financial due diligence process, the buyer obviously needs to verify everything that you've told them. The letter of intent is a good faith offer based on everything that you told them. Now they're going to sort of verify. It's called trust and verify. So they've trusted you that everything you've told them is accurate, and now they're going to verify it. So the first part of the financial due diligence is data collection. You've probably already sent them quite a bit, or we have, but most of that is only going back 1 year to kind of get your trailing 12 earnings picture together. Now it's the real data collection. We're going back a couple of years. We probably need at least 2 years of tax returns. We need financial data for at least the current year and the 2 previous. We need all kinds of documentation if you have run any personal expenditures through the business, which I know none of you would do, but we have seen that occasionally. And it's very common in all businesses. And that, again, this is, when you're going through this process, it's not an IRS audit. It's simply just a due diligence process to be sure that the buyer is paying for, to be more clear on exactly what the buyer is paying for. And the buyer typically will hire an outside, what's called a quality of earnings firm. It's actually an outside company. They're a third-party resource, unbiased, and they're going to dig in deep on all the financials that you've provided them or your advisor has. And again, this is another place where you might want to consider, having somebody help you, simply because they're going to really tear that earnings picture apart if they can. Obviously, if your earnings come down and they've offered to pay you a multiple of, say, 10, and the earnings go down, then obviously they're going to pay less for your practice. It's not that they want to, it's just their investors, their lenders require this. It's an important aspect of how their business is set up to acquire practices, grow practices, and offer returns to their investors. So the QOV firm will probably take at least 30 days to dig through the financials. They'll ask you a ton of questions, or if you have an advisor, they'll do it. Your advisor would take most of that burden off of you. And they're going to do, as I said, an extremely detailed analysis of kind of your post-sale earnings picture. And actually, at the end of that, there could be a price reconciliation. So if the earnings picture has changed, or if they've uncovered something that was not disclosed in the initial conversations, then you could have a second discussion around whether there's a price adjustment. And actually, for our clients, we set it up where the adjustment could be either way. If we find something that was not disclosed that was actually a positive earnings result, then the price would increase. So it's not over till it's over. And I guess my point is that, the letter of intent is a great starting point. Our goal is to get through closing without too much of a change to the initial terms. But that is, as I said, a long process. This goes concurrently with legal due diligence, and that's what Trey Cutler's here to talk about. Gary, I know you've worked a lot with Trey. I'll kind of turn it back over to you to introduce Trey, and he's going to kind of tell a little bit about himself and dive into the legal due diligence process, which is a big part of getting to close.
Jeff, thanks. And Trey, thank you for being on the call here too. We've worked together with Trey for many years, and I quit counting how many transactions we've worked on together of every various type that you can imagine. His knowledge and his industry expertise is not exceeded. So I'm happy to have him here. He can talk to you on a high level, because if we really got into what would occur on the second half or the second part of these transactions where the attorneys come in, we'd be here for easily several hours, or could probably do a day-long webinar on it. So Trey and I are on numerous conference calls every week with lots of parties, lots of veterinarians, just like everybody here. And so we're very used to doing these. So in that vein, Trey, I will turn the call over to you.
Thank you, Gary. We have worked together a lot, although I think I'm taking it a step too far, where I'm now a Gary Ackerman imposter, it looks like, judging from my screen. So I don't know what to make of that. Well, hello, everyone. Nice to get a chance to visit with you here. As Gary said, this will be very high level. It would probably make it much more digestible than if we were talking about the ins and outs, the details of some of the legal documents. Just briefly on me in terms of background, I was a young partner in a law firm in Dallas ages ago in the mid-90s, and my father-in-law was a veterinarian who owned a large practice in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he and a group of his colleagues, they really kind of had like a VMG group before there were even VMG groups. They kind of met collectively, they shared their books, they shared best practices, and they even brought in outside speakers, just really identical to what the VMGs have evolved into since then. At any rate, a subset of that group decided to roll up their practices into one company. And I ended up being the lawyer that did that. So that's how I got initially kind of introduced into working with the veterinary profession. And then a year later, I went on board with them when they raised money to go buy additional practices. And I helped them grow from the 19 practices to up to 75 when they finally sold to VCA. They were up to 75 practices. So it was about a 5-year stint that I had with them, and good with that, was fairly busy with that growth curve. So all of a sudden, at the end of that 5 years, I found myself very specialized in an area where I really never, when I went to law school or at any point in my career, I didn't plan this out. It's just kind of the way it all unfolded. And to my great pleasure, honestly, I've enjoyed working in this space tremendously. I enjoyed the people. They're wired the same way we are. We're very much win-win focused. We're very much wanting to kind of get good outcomes for all involved, and that's kind of our perspective. That said, they're also bright, and we hope we are as well, and we're kind of keeping an eye on all the things that they're trusting us to keep an eye on. So with that, I'll dive into the next slide with where we talk just a little bit about some of the specifics, kind of the main specifics that we focus on as part of the legal side of the transaction. So I don't know, Gary, if you were driving, or Jeff, or somebody else could advance to the next slide. There we go, thanks. So as Jeff was already alluding to, Jeff did a great job of describing the financial due diligence, where they're really scrubbing your numbers. And the whole point of that is to get a very good EBITDA number that they're basing their purchase price on. The other stuff that happens here is there's the legal due diligence. So this is it is really one of the three. It's not the overall of what we're doing here, but it's one of the three components of what we're doing here. So there's kind of three different parts of this process for us, and one of them is facilitating legal due diligence. So if they're scrubbing down your numbers in financial due diligence, they're really kind of, more than anything else, scrubbing down your liabilities and understanding what they're getting into with the legal due diligence. So good examples would be copies of all your contracts, not just your associate contracts, which they may or may not take assignments of. They may do their own forms depending on the buyer, but also other contracts that you have in place. And so we obviously help with that. Third-party leases would be a good example, where that can be very material, and something where we're helping with that whole process of getting a lease assignment. So bottom line is on the legal due diligence is, just when you felt like you've had more than enough of people asking for stuff, guess what? Somebody else comes and asks for more. The one benefit of working with the Ackerman Group in particular on this is they actually have a system where they try to make sure that whatever gets requested by whoever is asking for it, it goes to one place. It's an online data room. And so even the things that we're going to be asking for end up there. So instead of you getting asked for it first by the buyer, then by the buyer's lawyers, then by us, or maybe the other way around, us and then the buyer's lawyers, everybody can ask whatever they want, but they can go to this one online data room, which is extremely helpful. Otherwise, if we're doing this on a one-off basis, we're just going to make the same request. We make our usual requests, the buyer will make their usual requests, and we do the best we can to try to not have it be as repetitive as it inevitably is somewhat. But it is detail-oriented. You wouldn't expect people to be paying, in some cases, many millions of dollars for businesses without doing their homework, and this is an important part of it. Probably not quite as fine a point on this is what you see in the financial due diligence, but a lot of attention is paid to these things. So the next part of it is what we do is what everybody thinks of, I think, when respect to the legal process, and that is the legal documents. So we are certainly helping with review and negotiation of the details, the detailed provisions of all of the main transaction documents, which have been alluded to already a bit, which what you would expect: a purchase agreement, an employment agreement. You'll have restrictive covenants, non-competes that would be built in. You may have a joint venture arrangement, in which case you'll have some form of joint venture agreement, like an operating agreement if it's in an LLC. You'll have, if you own the real estate, of course, you'll have a lease. So all those, if you're buying the equity, then you're going to have some type of joinder into the, usually it's an operating agreement for the parent company. So there's all the different components of the transaction to have their own legal document, as you'd expect. And we are involved at the letter of intent stage, although probably less so for the Ackerman transactions than when we are doing them on our own. Because you're in good hands with the Ackerman Group. They're used to doing these on a regular basis. So, and they know, and Gary and I have had so many of these conversations around for so many years that I think we think alike on all of these issues pretty naturally anyway. So, but still, we're a little bit involved. There's always going to be much more detail in the definitive agreements than there will be in a 3 to 5 page letter of intent. So while we always want the letter of intent to cover the most important points for the transaction, as it was already described, inevitably it's the details are way more gory in the definitive agreements, and so that's why you bring in folks like us that can stand to read it, because that many people can't, which I understand. Anyway, we actually like it, so that's the good news. And speaking of details and minutia, the other piece of the puzzle that we help with is making sure that everything is appropriately mapped out in the disclosure schedules, which get attached to the purchase agreement. And that's a really important component from the seller's perspective, because it actually moderates your liability going forward if that's all done correctly. So if there's something that could be for example, a breach of a representation that you're making as a seller in the purchase agreement, if we've got it appropriately disclosed, whatever that matter is, then we avoid that ever being the potential of raising any liability for a breach, because there's no breach because we told you about it. We told the buyer about it as part of the disclosure schedules. So that actually goes hand in hand, as you might expect, with the legal due diligence. It's part of the reason why we care a lot about asking questions about legal due diligence, instead of just letting the buyer's counsel ask away and get whatever they want. We want to make sure that those disclosure schedules are comprehensive. And that you can move on to the next slide. Cool. And then just real quickly, just because people have questions about this oftentimes, what are the typical third-party issues? And again, I'm just going to kind of tick them off rather than diving in here, but I think it's helpful for people to know about them. So that if you're thinking about going through this process, really anytime soon, you're thinking ahead on these issues. So certainly your associate contracts, ideally you have associate contracts that have non-competes in them that are assignable on their own terms. If you don't, then then we always evaluate what makes sense to do at that particular stage of the game. But the associate contracts will be an important part of the overall process for the buyer. So whether you have them now or the buyer needs to get them as part of the purchase process, just layering in their own form of contracts, either way, that's going to be an important component. As you'd expect, if you've got debt, if you've got any liens on your practice assets related to debt that you have on those practice assets, then that's all going to have to be paid off. And oftentimes that will come up where that kind of surprises folks is in the context of what is actually real estate debt. You're still keeping the real estate, but then you don't realize, we don't have the ability to freely sell the practice assets, either because it's also collateralized or because of other limitations that are built into that real estate loan. So those are again, some of the details that we like to look at much sooner in the process than later, because if you have to do a refinance, for example, that's obviously something you can't just do in a blink of an eye. So the further ahead of the curve we can be, the better. Third-party real estate leases, I mentioned a moment ago, there's obviously that assignment process is something else we work through. Equipment leases typically are getting paid off unless, and that's not too difficult, it's just a matter of coordinating getting the payoffs, unless it's a situation where it's an equipment lease where you're really not paying for it currently, it's tied to some usage arrangement, which results in you not having to pay out of pocket, and that can continue to be that way rolling forward. Oftentimes we can get buyers to assume those. And then, of course, PPP loans, ideally getting forgiveness before, full forgiveness from the SBA before the closing. And if not, then there's a whole drill you have to go through for the escrowing the proceeds. So that's another one where it's good to be ahead of the curve. So with that, I've tried to give you as quickly as I can kind of the highest level view of what it is that happens. So demystify a little bit from the legal side. So hope that helps.
Trey, thank you. And for those who have interest in a greater level, I think we've got you for an hour on one of our other presentations that go over basically the same thing in a whole lot greater detail. But suffice it to say that Trey and I go back and forth a lot trying to work out to get the detail related to these things, to get, Trey puts everything in there. He and I kind of sometimes tag team on negotiating on different things. It's a lot of fun seeing what comes out of these, because it's a really nice finished product from everybody. Hey, Trey, we did have a couple of questions.
Yeah, I see that now. Yeah. So, yeah. You want me to dive in there?
Yeah, the first one was on the closing. Does the seller need local representation?
Yeah. So we're licensed. When I say we, I've got a firm where it's myself. There's 3.5 lawyers and a paralegal, and the lawyers are licensed either in California, in the case of my associates, or Texas and Colorado in my case. So in any of those 3 states, there's no need for local representation. Complete one-stop shopping, no issues. For the states where we're not licensed, all the other states, and as you might imagine, most of the transactions we do are in other states than those 3, even though we do a lot of volume in those states as well. Yes, you will need local representation. That said, the level of that representation is completely at your discretion. What we most commonly see is that the local attorney is used really on a rifle shot basis to handle the things that would be most appropriate for a local attorney to handle. So, for example, if you're selling if you're a corporation and you have a corporation and the name is the same as your practice, you're going to have to change that corporate name, and we would have your local counsel handle that part of it. Just as a good example of how kind of narrow it tends to be. Sometimes we're in a new state we've never been in, which frankly is happening less and less frequently because we've just been at this for a while. And there, it's very helpful to have the local attorney to give us some bigger, broader guidance on things like sales tax laws and the like in that particular state, or if there's anything else that we might not be aware of. Otherwise, if you're the landlord, making sure we've got the input on the lease, if there's anything that's unique to your state that we want and that would impact the lease, that tends to be helpful. So yes, do need local representation, but tends to be pretty narrow in scope.
And the other question, Trey, was about the 60 to 90 day letter of intent. Thought that it might be a little bit non-traditional or longer than usual and what we normally see.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I've been at this again. I was on the other side of this. I was in-house, with one of these consolidators for years, and it was the same then as it is now. Honestly, 60, 90 days is pretty reasonable. I sometimes see corporate buyers that have tried to lock up for longer periods. And honestly, all they're trying to do with this is, yes, they will want you to have it off the market during that time, but all they're trying to do is say, look, we're in agreement on all the major terms here. And we're both, the seller, are about to spend a lot of money on people like us, right? So you want to make sure that they're committed, they want to do this forward. They, on the flip side, are about to spend a lot of money if they're doing a Q&A review, or even if they haven't done it internally. They've got a lot of resource that they're going to be devoting to focusing on your transaction. And they don't want to do that if you're still, if you're not sure you want to move forward. So that 60, 90-day period, but they really need a good bit of that time to really scrub it down thoroughly for purposes of completing financial due diligence and legal due diligence, as we talked about. So very, very common here. Yeah, Gary, I don't know if you got other input, but that's
no, that was it. We just kind of move on for just a minute, and I'm sure we'll get more that are coming up. This is kind of the discussion about timing on how long they lock you up and different things. This is one of the diagrams for our website, and it really goes into how long different phases of the transaction should take. How long, the education process, we see that taking years. The planning process may take years, but once you get into it, you can identify the interest relatively quickly, you can negotiate it relatively quickly, and you can close it. But all of them are going to take 1 to 3 months to work through each different phase of the process. And then once you get through all of these phases, the next question that really comes up is, what happens at closing? We get all the way to the point where we've gotten letters of intent done and we've done legal documents done. And man, we see all kinds of people that are having issues with, they're concerned about how to tell their staff, how to tell their associates, what happens at the transition, all of these different things. And so we decided, rather than tell you a little bit about it, we'd get somebody on the phone here on the webinar here that does this every day. And so I'll introduce Jennifer Quispy. She is the Director of Integration for United Veterinary Care, and just like Trey, she's been on a lot of conference calls with us because this has been an area of angst for a lot of veterinarians. They don't know a lot about it, and so they want help. They want their hands held, and they want their staff's hands held. And so we asked Jennifer to come on here. She generally works mostly the month to 6 weeks or so before closing till about a month after closing. So Jennifer, I'll let you take it away and describe a little bit about where you are and what you do and all of the fun things you see right around the time of the transition.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Gary. So hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Quispy. As the Director of Integrations, I get the pleasure of working with multiple hospitals, and in doing so have really identified the best practices and really the things that you can anticipate during the integrations period. So all throughout due diligence, you're providing information and there's a lot of data gathering. The first thing you absolutely want to do when you start thinking about integrations, which is, about the 30 days prior to close, 30 days after, all of those transitionary processes, is you absolutely want to ensure that all of your current operating strategies within the hospital and the existing or the integration strategy that's going to be put forward are absolutely aligned. You want to make sure that you're working with someone or working with individuals in your team that fully understand the culture, the cadence of your hospital, because it will be imperative in creating a process that works well for you and is reasonable. We all know in this field, everyone within a hospital wears multiple hats, multiple shirts, multiple everything. And that's going to be true across the board. So you want to make sure that you're creating this process, and by doing so, you're identifying the timeline either with an integrations team that you're working with or within your team yourself, and that allows you to view the process as a whole. You want to cross all your T's, dot all your I's, and get a good cadence. Start assigning tasks and assigning meetings for training and things that will happen as a nature of the transition. It's important to start working on the integration process well ahead of the target close date. We like to say around 60 to 90 days. And the reason is by going through due diligence, you have already started your integrations process. A vast majority of the information that's gathered during that stage is information that will and can be used post-partnership. And you want to make sure that you get those deliverables to the due diligence team so that that information can then be parsed from the integrations team. So in an ideal world, your due diligence team and your integrations team, if you have one, will work closely together in order to better retain the information, revise the information so that there's no redundancies or redoing any work. And that is a huge time saver. So just make sure that you are asking or looking for that timeline ahead of time so that you can make sure that all of those questions have been answered. And then when using the same individuals within the due diligence and integration side, there's continuity, and that's absolutely invaluable during this process where there are so many small, minute details that are going to have to be transitioned. So outside of that, I do work a lot with our due diligence team in my company, but once the information is provided through due diligence, there's going to be a lot of information that you're going to need for the integrations process. And it's mostly going to pertain to things you already are anticipating, account transitions. So account transitions is just the formal change of ownership process that happens with anything that has an account number. It is important to remember that if it has an account number, it has to be transitioned. A lot of the times we start talking to veterinarians and they provide us with major veterinary vendors, which is a great starting point. Those are the things you want to transition right off the bat after partnership, but there are a lot of other things to consider, such as merchant services, small retailers, local vendors, even marketing services. You want to make sure you have those credentials at the ready. So the best thing that you can do for yourself is just start gathering that data and knowing that you have it available so that when it's either requested or required, you have it in front of you and there's no hiccup in the process. So you can get ahead by gathering account information from your bills, from your statements, just kind of gathering them all already. If you don't already have a master chart of accounts, which some of you may, and if you do, wonderful, that helps everyone. But it's likely that you just have all of the information in an internal database, an Excel spreadsheet, a Word file. That's good too. That's all information that you can provide. And as well with bills and statements for anything you don't have that information for. In this day and age, it's important to not forget online credentials. Most accounts now are managed online. And that being said, you probably have a browser that has a lot of that saved information. So you'll want to work with your team to extract that information, make sure you have the most up-to-date account information so that your integrations team, whether it be internal or whether it be a company you work with, can go through that process step by step and have every piece of information that account representative is going to need. So a lot of that can be extracted directly from your Google Chrome browser, your Safari browser, and can be exported easily into a spreadsheet. So anytime that you have an integrations team, for what you need to do as the seller, really the actions that are going to be required on your end for that process is going to be a lot of signatures. So you have to consider with a change of ownership, there's going to be new EIN, which means that there's going to be a new application, new account being open. Now it's important to go through a change of ownership process versus closing an account and reopening an account. It's a much different process and often has a much larger, longer timeline. And that's something we don't want. You don't want to disrupt any services, any ordering, anything that happens at your hospital. And the best way to do that, again, is just make sure you have all the information available and that you're ready to sign signatures. So a lot of it's just printing, signing digitally. And then again, with the online process, helping provide two-step verification. So we all know now that there are some websites where you try to log in from your home computer and it says, hold on, this is not a computer I recognize. Please provide verification that this is you by phone, by email. Unfortunately, your integrations team is not you. So a lot of those items that require that two-step verification is great to do over a scheduled phone call. Identify right off the bat, Google's a big offender. Some of the major vendors, credit card, merchant services, they'll want that two-step verification. Do it all on one call, right? It's going to take a lot of time out of your day to wait for those emails, wait for those phone calls. You don't want to have someone call you and say, in about 10 minutes, Google is going to call you with a 4-digit PIN. Can you please email it back to me when you're in the middle of a surgery, right? So it's best to kind of schedule those anticipated extra requests ahead of time. And account transitions in general. They don't happen overnight. It is the biggest process in the integration process at all. And in that respect, you'll be looking at a true-up process. So I know Gary is familiar with true-ups and what that looks like for you and your team, but it just allows all funds to be reconciled appropriately, all dependent on the first day of business. So what that'll look like is you'll provide likely your bank statements or items on the bank statements that are charged from your business vendor accounts or any vendor accounts that may have not completed the change of ownership process in a timeline. I can say from experience, having gone through the vendor process, there are some vendors that get back to us and process that change of ownership within 2 to 3 days. There are some that take a full month. Now, why does it take that long? There are a lot of things that sometimes need to be filed with some vendors like merchant services. You'll see things that require resale certificates, which may take a little bit longer to get. So while, in a lot of accounts, there's just one application, one process. In so many others, there are multiple steps and multiple processes that are not going to happen overnight. And so that being said, you might still see deposits, you might still see withdrawals on your account, and that's perfectly normal. And that true process will be able to reconcile. And the inverse of that is true. There may be a time that you send your new bill, right? And you have to pay with one card. You're not going to call and do a split payment. Then you'll want to reconcile the other way. So if anything was paid on your behalf, then that money will go back to the appropriate account. So that process is really spelled out during the integrations process, and just making sure you identify all of those charges, and you just kind of go through all your bank statements that are business accounts with a fine-tooth comb. So an example that I like to give, an example of a process that you really want to identify a timeline for is going onto a new payroll system, very often, or a different payroll system, because of the requirement of a new EIN, there needs to be a new account number. It's important to kind of identify the entire timeline from start to finish. It may sound like one process, but in that one process, there's an entire project management timeline. So you kind of want to identify your pay periods, make sure that that's communicated, create a transition from your pay period schedule to another, if there's any. And then, of course, identify to your team members that this is going to look like a new hire process, right? There's a new process, new owner. That now means that they're going to have to fill out new hire paperwork as if they had just started. So W-4s, direct deposit. And that's something that you want to make sure to communicate to your team and create a timeline around, dependent on that first day of business. So that all comes with working directly with an integrations team, but also something you'd want to identify yourself to make sure that there's no miscommunication with your team, specifically around their pay. There's no bigger way to add angst and stress to this process by leaving your team in the dark, or just not having clarity behind the process of what their paydays are going to look like, if there will be any change, if any. So that's something that I like to point out, because it is something that there are a lot of questions about. So when we're executing an integration timeline, it's also important to just identify a communication cadence and plan right off the bat. You want to make sure that you're working with a team that frequently updates each other, that meets frequently, that drafts communication for team leads as well as team members on any changes that need to take place, anything that's going to look different from them in a day-to-day process, and also just being open to fielding frequently asked questions and creating logs around that, so that you can update that frequently and provide consistent feedback. So outside of that, identifying who your integration team is going to be. So you, going through this process, likely have already identified who within your hospital are going to be your main points of contact to assist you with the transition process. In the most common scenario, we see that the seller is the main point of contact all through the process, all through due diligence. But the closer and closer you get to partnership, there are going to be changes that you want your practice manager, office manager, or another point of contact to be directly involved with, so that they can be involved with the specific training behind new processes, specific training around timelines, and being able to help you communicate that to the rest of your team. This process is imperative to kind of have an all hands on deck approach, so that you and your team leads can all be on the same page, so that everyone knows what's coming down the pipeline. There are no surprises outside of, maybe emergency surgeries coming in, but outside of that, there should be no surprises to this process. And then one of the biggest questions of all, how and when do I decide to communicate this to my team? Either change of ownership through, partnering with a corporate, or selling to an associate. Whatever the process is, it is a change, and it's something that your team members will want to know, and they will want to know that it comes from you. So the most important thing that I can advise is get ahead of the storm clouds, right? We know the questions that people are going to ask as soon as they hear about a change of ownership. Do I still have a job? Is there someone else that I report to? Is my pay rate changing? Get all of those answers ahead of time. Those are the questions people are going to ask. Those are the questions you would ask if this was divulged to you as well. So with that in mind, you want to be ready. Communicate all the important information in regards to the entire integrations timeline and other items as well. Now, transparency in this process is absolutely key, and working closely with your integrations team or your internal team to create and distribute all communications that are necessary. It's just going to help them be involved in the process. True transparency is key, and there's really no such thing as over communication, which I think is supposed to be on my next slide, but I forgot to mention that. But over communication is not a thing in this process. We want to make sure that everyone within the hospital has that comfort, right? We don't want to have any disruptions day to day that are unnecessary, and being able to have a true transparent timeline process and communication process is really important. And more importantly, I would advise that you should plan to collect and deliver feedback from all your team members just to continually improve the process, right? You might start noticing that the cadence needs to slow down. There's been a shortage in staff. These changes just can't happen in this time frame that you've created. Be malleable in your time frame. And you should want to work with a team that has that process as well, because these things can't happen if you're not confident in every single thing that you're doing. So just make sure that you're communicating that, and any changes that need to happen to the timeline are fair, right? As I said, most doctors, most practice managers are wearing so many hats, and integration takes time. And each hospital is different from the last. So working with an integrations team should know that and be able to create that timeline with you, put a plan into place ahead of time, and communicate updates frequently, and it'll just help the process be smoother and help the transition go smoothly and happy for everybody involved. And that kind of takes us through the first 30 days or so. And then everything from there is smooth sailing. And I'm open if anybody has any questions about the process or any specifics. I know we want to keep it high level, but if there are any curiosities involved in the idiosyncrasies of the integrations, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, Jennifer, we will let you take a breath. That is certainly a significant overview here. I'm interested in yours and Trey's opinion. One of the questions we got that I know both of you here is, when should we tell our doctors and staff? And you may have different answers because of your perspectives.
I can offer some of what I've seen work best. I've seen almost all strategies work best as long as you're pretty clear on what you want to accomplish. In a lot of timelines, we have the doctors are aware prior than the rest of the team, specifically because there are conversations that may need to happen well ahead, EA assignments, any adjustments. And if that's the case, then you would just want to make it clear to them and hope and trust them that they would make sure not to divulge to the rest of your team. In relation to closing, I have seen 7 to 14 days prior to closing is a good time to introduce that to your team. Set aside some time to meet with them and go over any questions, any concerns, and identify any pain points that they may have that maybe have not come to light on your side. So I've seen that be successful. I've also seen meetings after integrations or first day of partnership be successful, just so that we can ensure that all the important stuff gets out of the way. And then just communicating the tasks that they have due as well, because it's not just management. They'll have some things they need to take care of.
Yeah, I'll tag team on that. I agree with Jennifer. I like the 7 to 14 days. I like pre-closing, and I put myself in the position, if I'm one of the employees there and the first time I found out is the day that it's happening, it's happened already, I feel different about that, and I don't feel as trusted or valuable or anything else. I feel like it just got a major change got sprung on me, versus I got told about it. But it's nice where you're doing that relatively close to the closing, and if it's not close to if it's not right before the closing, or relatively close to closing, like the 7 to 14 days, what I think is the most important thing is when you do tell them that you've working with the integration team, so that there's somebody from the buyer that can be a face and ideally a presence answer a lot of those questions, so they can find out right away, look, this is just these are real human beings. Everything's going to be okay, you know, and the things that they're most concerned about, they can ask the question and hear the answer from somebody they can start to build some trust and rapport with. I think that's really important. From my perspective as a lawyer, what I tend to advise is don't do it too early when you're still negotiating material terms, because you don't want to go announce it and then have something blow up and you don't do the deal. So you want to have a very high degree of certainty that the transaction's going to close. And honestly, most of these, after the letter of intent, they do close. But if there's still third-party issues where there's some uncertainty as to whether it could close or not, don't tell the whole staff. You know, sort those things out first, and make sure you got a very high degree of certainty before you start making announcements. That's my take on it.
And my comment on that and other things is I have two of the people on this call that when we get all these questions from our clients and everything, that I send them to the two of you. I'm sending them to Trey for answers about the legal side of it. And then when they've got questions about what the transition is like, I'm sending them to Jennifer. So, because that's the areas that each of you specializes in. One of the things that became really obvious on this call, I was kind of just thinking about it. I look at who's on this call. The people on this call, when we start and go through a process, I bet we've got 20 Zoom calls with a typical seller from start to finish that I'll start on them doing planning with the seller and things along that line. Jeff comes in that works on some of the offer analysis, brings in his financial team, brings in his due diligence team, creates the data room. After things get a little closer and we're under letter of intent, Trey comes in and he's doing all of the legal things. And at the very end, Jennifer comes in and she's doing all the transition. You got on a closing that this group is working on, you probably have 20 Zoom calls right here, just with the people on this call. So just trying to make sure you're trying to understand what this process is like. Now, especially in the era of COVID, there's not as much on-site visits or things along that line. So there is a lot of the different pieces of this transaction that's done just like we're doing on this webinar. So the question is, how can we help? All of us here can help on the different facets of it. The first thing I would tell you is this is not for the inexperienced. This is something where you need resources to make them heard. Don't do it alone. This is like, you being a veterinarian coming out of school and going to do a TPLO straight out of school. You have enough knowledge to be dangerous, but certainly not enough to do it on your own. Ask lots of questions, get engaged with multiple different people. Again, the advisors we talked about, everything from the attorney to your financial advisor to your CPA. These are all pieces that should be integrated, get engaged. I mean, the whole purpose we're doing these webinars is to bring education and resources, and we put them on our website so you can go and listen to them any amount that you want to get up to speed with the lingo and what's going on in these transactions, because you're going to have to be educated to make good decisions. We at Ackerman Group will work with you. We do free evaluations on your practice to give you a kind of a snapshot of where you are right now as far as what we think your profitability is likely to be. We also will give you it's basically a series of comps where we'll compare what your practice would sell for with others that we've sold for that are of similar size and similar earnings, so we can know where you fit in the kind of the pecking order of practices, and grow your confidence simply by joining these things. Look in the resource center, talk to any of the people that are on this call or the people at the companies, with the realization the companies, the business development side of the companies, their job is to make you like their company, but also educate you about their company along the way. We're big fans of you talking to the different companies so you can learn a lot about the different companies, because ultimately you're going to get engaged to one and you're going to marry one. And so, in our mind, our sentiment is that you should know, you should date for a while. You should understand these people, because I think this is all important in understanding the company that you're going to get involved with. But all of this is just education. And I know, I think one of our webinars on our knowledge base is called Listen to Your Peers. And what's interesting is it's got 4 different veterinarians on there that we've taken through the whole process that started out, that were all very, very well educated doctors. They had done, they were all VMG members. Some of them had multiple practices. Some of them were specialists. And the universal opinion coming through it was that they didn't know how much they didn't know. They didn't know how much they get educated through the process. And so, my words of wisdom to everybody is get some help. whether it's us or somebody else, you got great people you're talking to on this call, but there's other knowledge out there, but get some help, because it is one of those things that it's a little tougher. You can absolutely do it yourself. The question is, are you going to do it to the best extent that you possibly could? So next week or 2 weeks from now, we're going to have our next webinar on what to expect in today's market. This is going to be interesting, because the last 12 to 18 months with COVID and things like that, man, there's been a lot of ups and downs in the market. We had a 2 or 3 month period where it basically shut down, and then we had kind of an aha moment where people figured out that veterinarians were actually not going to shut down, and then we had a little bit later in the year, we had a lot of people that figured that veterinarians were actually doing pretty good, and so a lot of the private equity has decided that this is an area that they might like to add additional investment to, and there's certainly more people coming to the market and more interest in it, and it's proven very, very resilient during COVID. So I'm really interested to hear what some of our panel of corporate people, corporate veterinary owners and private equity people and things have to say about what to expect in the current market. We've done this before, and it's been an interesting discussion, because we're seeing the kind of the under the hood as to what these companies are thinking about in the current market. So looking forward to having everybody on that. We might have one more question. So there was a question related to seller financing. Is seller financing a good trade? Have you got any thoughts on that? That we've done a fair amount of installment notes for people in the past.
Yeah, it's been something that's actually been kind of available, really kind of on an optional basis, typically, with these corporate groups. And for some cases, it's made a lot of sense just as part of an overall tax planning strategy and investment strategy. Now, with the potential for capital gains rates to go up, it's maybe a little less attractive, frankly, than it might have been before. So I suspect we probably won't see a lot of it right currently in the current environment. Once the rates go up, if that's what happens, then I'm guessing people might look at it differently again. We'll see.
That tax law changes and things like that is certainly driving some of the activity that we're seeing now on the part of potential sellers. One other question is, do we only handle corporate sales at Ackerman Group? That's all we're doing currently. We're happy to look at your practice and do an evaluation on your practice, and we'll certainly give you some ideas to where, whether you might be good as a corporate sale or other types of sales, or we definitely have done referrals out for people for other valuations or other people if they needed a consultant or things along that line to work on profitability or things like that. We certainly know the people in the industry to send you to in the appropriate circumstance.
Gary, while you were talking earlier, I went ahead and responded to one of the questions that had come through about closings being contingent on all doctors staying and the staff staying. Yeah. And I see once I answered, I thought it was going to stay up there in the questions, but then it goes over to the answered column. So I didn't know whether everybody had seen that response or not. But just quickly on that, yes, the associates being on board definitely is a condition to closing. Typically, for staff, it usually is not. It's never worded that way, and I've never seen it be an issue. So wouldn't expect that to be a problem. But with the associates, yes. And if you've got a part-time associate or somebody who's a relief vet, that comes in every other week or something, and that person's not going to work there anymore for whatever reason, that's not going to blow up the deal. But if you have a full-time associate that's not going to be there, that is something that would have to be looked at carefully. For sure.
Okay, Trey, thanks. Jeff, any final comments here?
Guys, I think we missed one question that came in, and I think we'd be remiss not to answer it. But it's the question is, do most inform staff before closing? So, Trey, I wonder if you have any situations where a hospital would have closed without telling their staff. I can't imagine what the implications might be there.
Yeah, Jennifer and I were trying to speak to that earlier, and Jennifer, you showed your hand where you acknowledged that it does happen. I actually, that's not my preference, as I commented on before. It's not something that I recommend. It creates potential for more of a negative reaction in the practice. It's not that it never happens, but I don't think it's best practice, honestly. It's so funny to me because I see the whole range. I mean, I see some people where they have no problem. They tell everybody immediately. and they're not the least bit worried about it. And other people, they're just the other end of the spectrum. It's the last thing they want to do, and they're really worried about it. And it's the same issue. So it rarely causes, the people that are anxious, rarely, really, if ever, does it ever grow into anything that they were actually concerned about.
So we see a lot of angst related to that. There's no question about it. A lot of hand-holding required. My general sentiment is that no matter what you think is going to happen when you tell the staff, it will be different.
Yeah, that's good advice. But if you can answer the questions quickly, like we talked about before, which is, what Jennifer's been speaking to, you're organized and you're ready, you've got those answers ready, and you can have them, the buyer, in front of them quickly. Honestly, it tends to be way less of a concern in the end than people think going into it.
Right.
So Gary, the only thing I'd add is this webinar will be on our website tomorrow. Anybody like to watch it again, or if you've got a colleague that couldn't make it tonight and you'd like to share that with them, please do so. So we really appreciate you joining. Gary, I'll leave it up to you to close.
Thanks everybody for attending, and we appreciate you for coming to this one, and please look at any of the others you'd like to on our website. Trey, Jennifer, as always, we thank you for your great input here. This is very valuable stuff.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Our pleasure.
Okay, good night.
Good night.